So my name is Thomas, and let's see, we're just waiting for some slides. Let me just share how many of you guys have heard about the quantified self community. There are a few. How many of you are doing or have been doing any kind of self-tracking or biohacking yourself? How many of you have gotten some valuable, sustainable results out of self-tracking or biohacking? It seems like we have an issue here where I guess I will talk without my slides to begin with to just entertain you people. I can tell you about the Quantified Self community then, which I've been part of since 2011. And it started actually 10 years ago when some people, they met up in the basement in Pacifica, a guy called Kevin Kelly's house in Silicon Valley. And they met up because there were all these new enabling technologies coming out where people were starting to gather data from their everyday life. And it turned out that at that first meeting, even in the fall of 2007, there were people tracking a host of different things. And in 2011, there was the first conference in Mountain View, also in Silicon Valley, in the Quantified Self community. And I went there, and I met all these other self-trackers, and it was an extremely nerdy thing with people tracking crazy stuff. And you can imagine this were the older days in the sense that I had a poster, last-minute poster I did about my personal tracking project, and just next to me at this camping small table, Dave Asprey, that is now the Bulletproof guy, he was sitting and trying to tell people about HRV and how you can track that, and he had talked a bit about his coffee stuff too then, but it was very early days. But what it showed was that there were some people already then working with this stuff and trying to experiment with what can you actually track and can you potentially also learn something from it. And what we've seen in the years since 2011, 12 is that a lot of the things that seemed crazy then, just 5 years back, we've started doing a lot of people are doing this stuff in their daily living. The activity trackers, they have become commonplace. 5 years ago, there was still a kind of strange thing to wear. I've been doing a lot of food tracking, as I'll show you later on. And that was really strange in 2011, taking photos of everything you eat. But today, people, they snap photos of their food and post it on Instagram. That's like 8-year-olds, they do that. So a lot of these practices around self-tracking, they have become much more commonplace. And now the idea that you can actually potentially get something out of self-tracking is also much more commonplace. There was a lot of criticism back then, which was like, what could you even get out of this? And I think that was from the misconception that it would be known in advance. What has really shown itself to be the case is that we have had to experiment with these techniques and these methods for self-tracking to see what can you actually learn and which kind of phenomena can you address, which kind of issues can you address by doing self-tracking. So just to give you an idea about where I started and where I've kind of arrived at now at this point is that some 10 years ago, I had some allergies and eczema that was getting worse and worse. And it wasn't only like the symptoms related to allergies or eczema as such, it was also like fatigue during the day, not being able to think clearly or think as clearly as I was used to. And I was getting kind of desperate. And then I set myself on this journey of self-tracking. And some of the results I've had is that in 2010, I stopped taking allergy medication. And I haven't used any allergy medication since 2010. I'm able to stay mentally sharp throughout the day, which I couldn't even 5 years ago. I can now condition my sleep. so I can kind of program my sleep. I know how much sleep I need when my body is operating as I'd like it to. Um, I just realized last year that I haven't seen a medical doctor since 2008. I haven't had any kind of acute stuff going on, so the things that I've been addressing, I've been able to address myself um, by doing my own experiments and my own interventions. That was just some of my results. I was just reminded last night that there are even results I don't remember, which is I was very allergic to cats too 10 years ago, and I have some friends there living in a house. They have a cat, and I stay with them in their basement. And 10 years ago, I couldn't stay in their basement because I would get allergic symptoms. And just before coming here, the other night, I slept a full night there. I got up at 4:15. I was mentally alert, no symptoms at all. Uh, so now I can even be around cats, which I couldn't 10 years ago. So that's also kind of what happens in this kind of very long running process, which is I kind of forget what went on 5, 7 years ago and which bodily state I was in then, because it's just changed so much. Um, and then I can use my data from back then to go back and look at what was my state then, to just remind myself, because the kind of bodily experience, the kind of bodily sense of how I felt then is kind of fading. And of course I appreciate that, because it wasn't a particularly nice feeling back then. There was a lot of frustration, I can tell now, and perhaps even desperation, because I could see as like in my early 30s, I was starting to feel like an old man, and that wasn't exactly what I wanted at that point in my life. And I could see if I just kept on going on that trajectory, then I would feel like an even older man when I really get old. So I feel younger now, 10 years later, than when I started doing the self-tracking and self-experimentation. Yeah, so the presentation I prepared and my approach for today is that I will tell you something about my results. I will also show you some of my data, and I'll tell you about how you can approach these things. But I plan for kind of leaving you guys unsatisfied with what I've actually done with my interventions, because there's a lot of talk here in the biohacking community around the interventions. And what I've found, and what I've for myself, and what I've seen also in Quantify Self, is it's very personal. What you need to do based on your specific situation, then you can take cues from other people. So my aim with this talk is actually to leave you unsatisfied on what I did, what I have done to my diet, what have I done to my environment, what have I done with probiotics, fermented food. I actually won't talk about that, but you can come and ask me afterwards, and then we can talk about where you're at and where some of my ideas and the things I've tried, they might work for you, and how you can approach testing it. Because I don't have the cure for allergies. That's not my. That's never been my aim, and that would also be. It would be kind of a dangerous kind of proposition to come with. Part of my talk is telling you guys how can you take the scientific method and kind of boil it into something you can use in your everyday life, and that's also one of the kind of you ask about the meta level. A quantified self is kind of that method for how can you approach these kind of very individual, personal issues in your everyday life, and how can you potentially track it? How can you start experimenting? And the thing is that if you zoom into our daily living, there's such a complexity that some of the ways that you set up, like medical clinical studies, it doesn't really work, because you can't control all the different factors in the same sense. So this process is much more iterative, and it's much more messy. But it's also your own process, and it's about figuring something out for yourself that's potentially beneficial to yourself, and then other people might be able to be inspired by doing it. I think that's a really valuable part of it, because the specific interventions, they are really different among people. What works for one person might not work for another. So there is a challenge here in this room. You have a challenge. If you look at the vendors, there's so much to choose from, and where to start. And that will be part of what I'll be talking about. So we have these two parts of my talk, which is my self-tracking journey, and then how could you debug your life if you want to. And these are my personal results. As I mentioned, that I stopped using allergy medication in 2010. And actually, I didn't mention before, but I can tell when my immune system is fighting something harmful and when it's an allergic reaction. And these were like some indicators where bad stuff went up and good stuff went down 10 years ago. And then I went to some doctors in Denmark, and they were actually nice. But the problem was that I didn't see any problem-solving method to my specific issues. And especially with allergies and eczema, it's just treating symptoms. And at that time, I was working in the software industry with the process improvement in companies as a consultant. And I've also been developing software since I was a kid. And I know how to debug systems. I know how to look at a system. How does it perform? What's the behavior? And how can you potentially make it work as intended? And I was very inspired by the method that Toyota they're using, and they got some of their stuff from W. Edwards Deming down in the corner, and he taught the Japanese to use this PDCA method, which is actually the scientific method boiled down, so you can have factory workers use it to do continuous improvement on your work processes. So PDCA stands for Plan, Do, Check, Act. So you have this cycle running all the time, and when you're addressing problems, I really think there are two sides to problem solving. There's the one side which is the problem, and it's to know the problem, and it's to really understand the problem deeply before you start solving it. And when you want to solve a problem, I learned that from Toyota too, you want to address the root cause so it doesn't come back. If you're only treating symptoms, the problem will come back. Then you also want these solutions to be durable, so you can maintain them over time, and you will also want them to be sustainable. So for instance, there are medical solutions to stuff that are very harsh interventions, and you don't want to be taking, for instance, strong medication for many years. If you have something chronic, you want to have mild interventions. So this is a disclaimer to that I'm not a medical doctor, but that was also a starting point for me. Because in Denmark 10 years ago, you couldn't get all these kind of tests for biomarkers and stuff. So I couldn't get doctors to prescribe blood tests. So I arrived at this thinking that if I wanted to get this process going, I needed data on how my body was performing, how my system was performing. But I also needed to have these phenomena that I could observe myself, because there weren't anybody else that could help me with observing what was going on. So that's why I've done a lot of tracking with using my consciousness, my awareness, and noticing things. And I'll show you different kinds of data. And also, what I've been looking for is what worked for me. I haven't been looking for any general solutions for humanity as such. I tried to look at what works for me individually with my allergies and eczema. However, what I claim is that even when my interventions, they are personal, then the method for doing this is general. And that's why I'll, in the second part, talk about how you could potentially take these ideas and run with it. Then something about my data collection. I have more than 110,000 actively made observations, where I have, for most of them, been pulling out a smartphone, snapping a photo of food, for instance, or registering a yawn, or like itching eczema or something. So I have more than 110,000 of those observations. And my guess is that it's taken me around 500 to 600 hours just pulling out smartphone, making observation, putting it back into the pocket. Then I also have passively sensed data from wearables like activity, exercise, sleep, heart rate, posture. And then I've actually been using 3 different generations of instruments for doing it. So I started using mind maps and like old feature phones with the old cameras and writing things in text files in the file system. Then I was part of building a smartphone app that I used for many years, and now I'm collaborating with my around building instruments that you can wear on your body to make these kind of observations. So, for instance, I've done a lot of food tracking. So just snapping photos of food, I've never done any calorie tracking. You can learn a lot by just looking at photos. So I have already almost 9,000 of those observations. I've tracked a lot of water consumptions. I've tracked a lot of different supplement intake over the years when I've been doing experiments with that. I've been tracking symptoms, for instance, like sudden chills or sudden fatigue. I have almost 8,000 of those. I've been tracking eczema. I'll show you more of my eczema data. I've been tracking bodily functions like sleep, toilet visits, 11,000, toilet visit with elimination, almost 4,000. Host of other different other phenomena of interest. I've been tracking, if any of you know the Pomodoro technique, I've been tracking Pomodoros to see things about my productivity. And then, of course, my claim to fame, my sneezes. That I've tracked every single sneeze since May of 2011. And last year I sneezed 280 times. And this is the distribution from 2011 to 16. And what you see is that 2012 was an interesting year. And what I did there was that in 2011 I had kind of a strict diet. Then in 2011 I made it much less strict. And then I had a lot more sneezing. Then in 2013 I went back to an adapted version of the stricter diet. I was able to lower the sneeze count for that summer, and I've been able to reduce it further over the years. The reason why there are more sneezes in 2016 is that I did what I call a stress test of my system during the pollen season to see how I would react if I put some extra load on my system. That worked really well too. So this is a heat map of my sneezes. So you can tell really that my sneezes, they happen during only like a very short time span during the summertime in late June. This is another way of looking at the sneezes where each step up is one sneeze. You can see when you have a sharp cliff, that's when I produce a lot of sneezes, and that's also in the middle of the year. I rarely sneeze during wintertime. In the fall and the spring, it's like in June, that's where I produce the most of my sneezes. This is same kind of charting it, but there you have the comparison between 2016 2011. And what if you notice something, then actually 2016 I arrived like early summer at a higher sneeze count than in 2011. So that's over there with the gray area where it's on the white. And there was, I know exactly what that was. There was a day in New York City where it's very hot and there was a lot of pollen in the air, and I had to run several times to get to the subway. And down there's some kind of oil or something they're using, which combined with the pollen makes me sneeze. Then I've been observing my eczema too. So I made more than 15,000 observations of eczema, both like itchiness, but also with photo. And this kind of shows you how you can be tracking something, then learn something, and then not track so much anymore. So you see, I've really had a peak of tracking eczema in 2014, and then I arrived at ways of handling it that are working pretty well. So I don't track it that much anymore. I only track it when there's something really notable going on that I want to document. So this is, I hope this isn't too gross, but these are some of my observations, like snapping photos of my hands. And then 80 slides later, you have some of the latest observations. And then over the years, it's been a process where it's improved, and sometimes I've been able to track that it's actually completely gone from my hands, and it's actually a good day today. It's a good fall, and you see those different episodes. They also spread over the years, and then also I've been documenting when it's been really bad. So I've had these cycles and these learnings over the years, and I've been tuning my approach. I've been looking at the different seasons. What should I be doing during the summertime? What should I be doing during wintertime? Also, if you come look at me really close, you can tell that the skin around my eyes has improved a lot since 2010, which is just, I don't apply anything. It's from the other changes in my body that the skin around my eyes that looked like that for 30 years just improved. So basically, I've been looking at my body as a decision-making system where I've been trying to kind of nudge it into making different decisions. So instead of having my body sneeze when it encountered grass pollen, I tried to nudge it into a different state so it would have a different reaction. And so for you guys who know about quantified self, you probably also know about the show and tell format. And this is what we do, is answering basically 3 questions. What did you do? How did you do it? And what did you learn? And on quantifiedself.com, there are more than 1,000 videos of these shows and tells. And there you can go if you want inspiration for how to track stuff and inspiration for even which kind of stuff you can track. There's a lot of interesting material there. And when you're doing a show and tell, there's actually something going on beforehand. And what I'll tell you about then is, how can you think about this process? How can you debug your life? And a question to ask yourself, or 3 questions, is what do you want to in your life to have more of? What do you want to have less of? Or what are you curious about? What do you want to look into? Those are like 3 questions, good questions for figuring out what is important to you if you want to go into self-tracking and some biohacking. And I call it a pocket-sized scientific method for everyday life. And the 2 basic concepts that oftentimes are kind of not being that clear in this space. And one concept is observation. That's looking at stuff, what's going on. And I've, of course, been doing a lot of that. And then there's the other part, that's intervention. That's changing things. There's tracking things, changing things. And when you go in and talk to the vendors, then you could kind of be thinking about these 2 things. What are this vendor, what are they selling? Are they selling something to observe things with, or are they selling something to change things with? Are they selling interventions, or is it a mix of observing things and changing things? A learning from my own project, I would say from Quantified Self too, is that you probably want to err on the side of observations, especially to begin with. You want to establish some baselines on what is really going on, because if you don't know what's really going on, you don't know whether you're improving or not when you start doing interventions. So I put a little more weight to the observation side, and especially in the beginning. And I would say start with 1, 2 things, not much, and just go from there to learn. Then as part of this pocket-sized scientific method, there are also hypotheses. And it's a big word, but I think you could make it really easy and simple too. It's like asking yourself, what is this about? So for instance, if you want to sleep better, what is this really about? Is it about my sleep? What might be going on here? What are the factors impacting what's going on? And how will you know what is going on? That's kind of like the tracking dimensions. And then also try to make your expectations clear, like come up with an idea about, for instance, do I expect to sneeze a lot this summer compared to last year? That could be a question. I posed that question to myself, and it was like, I expect to sneeze less. And for you guys, it might be, if I want to sleep better, what does that really mean? What do I expect to see when I sleep better? Then there's the protocol, which is also kind of simple, which is, what are you going to do, and how are you going to do it? You have to be able to make it something that is operational, then you can do in your daily living. And when it comes to self-tracking, there are two basic kind of categories. One is like the active self-tracking that I've been doing really a lot, and that's noticing things from the inside. That's using your own consciousness to noticing things. So that can be sensations in your body. For me, like there's no sneeze tracking device, so I'd use my consciousness to notice sneezes and then record it. It might be the itchiness of my eczema. There's no device that can measure itchiness from the outside, so I have to record that stuff myself. And then there's the passive sensing, which is getting measured from the outside. Of course, you have activity trackers that measure from the outside. That's a good example. You can do heart rate variability. You can do stuff like that. That's like classically what medicine is doing, is measuring you from the outside. And of course, a lot of those techniques that they have become available to private people now. And then on the other side, on the intervention side, here's my piece of advice, which is you would be looking for interventions where you can solve a big problem with a small, mild, cheap interventions where you don't have to change much. In a low leverage situation, you have a relatively small problem and you have to use a big intervention to just change it a little. With high leverage, you'll find these factors in your personal life where you can change a few things and you get big results. And that's what I've been aiming for over the years, because you don't want to have to execute these big interventions for the rest of life. You want to find something that's simple and that's cheap that you can do. But that process might be messy. And that's why you want to close the loop between what you're observing and what you are changing to see, are things improving? Are they getting worse? What are you learning? And then you'll have to iterate. You have to carry on. It's very rare that people, they just get results after 2 weeks. I've been doing this stuff for almost 10 years. And I've learned a lot of things that I didn't even know I could learn anything about. So one of the overall learnings for me is also that my personal data has beat the generic molecules of the medication that I was offered. By collecting data and reflecting on the data and then experimenting with interventions, I've arrived at something that's much better and much more sustainable for me than using those generic molecules that can be prescribed. And then also, data tomorrow beat data in a year. So if you have some issue, don't wait for some other people to build some kind of tracker that can automate something. Start tracking tomorrow, because you'll learn something already the day after tomorrow about what's going on. And then in a year, you'll already have a year of learnings around your specific issue or your area of interest. So that was my talk without mentioning my specific interventions. So if you want to know some more about what I've been doing in detail, please come talk to me. Thank you so much.